Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dim the lights, cozy up, and sneak into the hushed, pigment-stained studios of the Renaissance. Imagine for a moment the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across a half-finished fresco, the scent of linseed oil heavy in the air, and there amidst the chaos of creation, a master artist, perhaps Leonardo himself, slumped over a dusty workbench, snoring softly. You probably won't survive this journey without feeling a sudden, overwhelming urge for a nap yourself because we're talking about when Renaissance artists took naps in studios. It's not just about grand masterpieces and divine inspiration. It's about the very human, very relatable need for a quick snooze when exhaustion hits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from, say, a tiny apartment in Tokyo at 3 a.m., or maybe a cozy cottage in rural Ireland, just as the sun sets, drop your location and local time in the comments below. Let's see how many sleepy historians we have out there tonight. And remember to like and follow the channel to keep up with all the next exciting parts of our journey through history's forgotten siestas. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported not to a grand cathedral, but to a surprisingly humble, often chaotic space, the Renaissance Artist's Studio. Forget the pristine, minimalist white walls you see in modern art galleries. This wasn't just a place of work. For many artists, especially the younger, less established ones, it was their entire world. It served as their home, their workshop, their classroom, and sometimes, much to their secret delight, their very own napping nook. You'd wake up to the smell of drying paint, a chorus of apprentices grinding pigments, and perhaps the low murmur of your master sketching out a new commission. It was a 24/7 operation, a true live workspace long before that became a trendy real estate term. Think less chic loft, more bustling, dusty dormitory with an artistic flair. This blend of living and working meant that the concept of a strict workday was, shall we say, a bit fluid. There were no punching clocks, no HR departments, and certainly no official nap breaks on the books. Instead, life flowed with the rhythm of the work, the availability of light, and the demands of the patron. We'll get to those demanding folks later, trust me. If you needed to sleep, you often did so where you were when you could. Historians still argue whether this constant proximity to their art fostered greater creativity or simply led to chronic sleep deprivation. But you can imagine how tempting a quick power nap would be when your bed was literally just a few steps from your easel. It probably explains why so many Renaissance figures have those perpetually tired, yet intensely focused eyes in their portraits. They weren't just deep thinkers. They were likely just really sleepy. You might even find yourself wondering if that slight tilt of the head in some famous sculptures wasn't a pose, but simply the artist trying to get comfortable enough to doze off for a minute. This informal setup also meant that the studio became a repository for all manner of personal effects mixed in with artistic tools. You might stumble over a half-eaten loaf of bread, a pile of rumpled tunics, or even a snoring apprentice tucked beside a stack of canvases. It was a pragmatic existence driven by the need to maximize working hours and minimize living expenses. The very architecture of these studios often reflected this dual purpose. Many were on the upper floors of buildings, not just for the light, but also to separate the creative chaos from the more respectable street-level businesses. It also meant a quieter space perfect for catching a few Z's when the inspiration or your energy waned. This wasn't some grand purpose-built sanctuary of art. It was a gritty, lived-in space where life and art intertwined in a way that would make any modern minimalist shudder. And sometimes you just had to pull up a stool, lean against a wall, and let your eyes drift shut for a moment. Nobody was going to judge you too harshly, especially if they were planning on doing the same thing themselves within the hour. One of the most relentless, unforgiving, yet utterly essential elements dictating the Renaissance artist's day, and by extension their nap schedule, was light. You see, back then, there were no adjustable studio lights, no fancy LED panels, no dimmers to manipulate the mood. You were entirely at the mercy of the sun. Imagine a massive unglazed window, sometimes several of them, bathing the studio in a glorious golden glow for part of the day. This was the artist's lifeblood, the very essence that allowed them to see color true to capture the subtle play of light and shadow on a face to bring a painting to life. Without it, you were effectively blind your brushes, idle your palette, a useless smear of pigments. This reliance on natural light meant that the workday began at dawn, often before it, as artists scurried to maximize those precious hours. You'd be up with the roosters, probably feeling more like a zombie than a creative genius eager to catch the first rays. As the sun climbed higher, flooding the studio with intense brilliance, the work would be in full swing. But what happened when the sun began its slow descent? Well, the quality of light would change, softening, becoming less reliable for detailed work. And then as dusk approached, the studio would gradually plunge into gloom. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a hard stop. You couldn't exactly paint the delicate folds of a drapery or the glint in an eye when you could barely see your hand in front of your face. So the working day was effectively dictated by the celestial clock. This meant intense bursts of activity during peak daylight hours, followed by a necessary winding down as the light faded. Historians still argue whether this forced rhythm of intense focus, followed by mandatory rest periods, contributed to the unique brilliance of Renaissance art, or if it simply meant artists were perpetually exhausted. You can picture it, a master frustrated by the fading light, dropping his brush with a sigh, perhaps running a hand over his weary eyes. What better time for a quick, involuntary slump into slumber? It wasn't about laziness, it was about the simple reality of pre-electric existence. You worked when you could see, and when you couldn't, well, your body had other plans for you. This often led to the natural ebb and flow of energy, making a midday or late afternoon nap a pragmatic, if unscheduled, part of the artist's life. Think of it as nature's forced coffee break, except instead of caffeine, you got a few minutes of blissful unconsciousness. The setup of these studios was optimized for light, often featuring large north-facing windows to ensure consistent indirect illumination, crucial for painting without harsh shadows. But even the best designed studio couldn't cheat the sun. On a cloudy day or during the shorter winter months, the available working hours dwindled dramatically. You'd find yourself squinting, straining your eyes, your artistic vision literally blurring with the decreasing light. It's not hard to imagine you, the apprentice, being sent scurrying to fetch more candles, only for the master to declare the light still insufficient, deciding instead to rest his eyes. A euphemism, perhaps, for a quick catnap. This practical limitation meant that artists had to be incredibly efficient with their time, often pushing themselves to their limits during the brightest hours. And what happens when you push yourself to the limits? Your body tends to stage a quiet yet firm rebellion. You might start to feel your eyelids grow heavy, your head nod as if pulled down by an invisible string. A quick lean against a sturdy easel, or even a slump onto a pile of discarded cloths, could provide a brief restorative escape. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we mentioned in a previous, completely different historical context? Well, this isn't quite as bizarre, but it's another reminder of how resourcefulness was key in a world without modern conveniences. With the sun dictating the rhythm of the day, you might imagine Renaissance artists simply packed up their brushes when dusk fell. But oh, how wrong you'd be. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and for many artists, the fading light of day simply pushed them towards nocturnal ventures. You see, while natural light was king for painting and delicate detail work, other tasks didn't demand such pristine illumination. Imagine the flicker of a single tallow candle, its weak flame casting dancing shadows across the studio as an artist bent over a drawing, perhaps sketching out compositions for tomorrow's fresco, or meticulously sharpening their tools. This wasn't glamorous work. It was often the grunt work, the preparation, that freed up precious daylight hours for the actual painting. You might be grinding pigments, a monotonous but essential task, by the dim glow of an oil lamp, your muscles aching, your eyes straining. Or perhaps you'd be stretching canvases, preparing panels, or boiling down animal glue, a notoriously pungent late-night activity that probably smelled something akin to a particularly aggressive locker room. Historians still argue whether this nocturnal labor was a mark of the artist's relentless dedication or simply a desperate attempt to meet impossible deadlines. Whatever the motivation, it undoubtedly messed with their sleep cycles. You can almost hear the soft scratching of charcoal on paper, punctuated by the occasional yawn, or perhaps a mumbled curse as a tired artist smudged a line. The light sources themselves were a challenge. Tallow candles made from animal fat flickered and smoked, casting a warm but dim light that struggled to penetrate the gloom. Oil lamps, while slightly better, still offered limited illumination and produced soot that could settle on freshly painted surfaces. Imagine trying to capture the subtle nuances of a human form by a light source that constantly threatened to go out, leaving you in complete darkness. It was a tedious, often frustrating experience, making the allure of a brief nap, even amidst these dim struggles, almost irresistible. You might find yourself propped up against a wall, the warmth of the lamp a small comfort as your eyes drifted closed just for a moment, just to recharge. This nocturnal rhythm wasn't just about practical tasks. It also fostered a different kind of creativity. Without the pressure of direct observation, artists might have used these hours for more introspective work, for planning, for conceptualizing. Some scholars even suggest that the quiet solitude of the night might have been a time for deeper contemplation, allowing ideas to brew and simmer away from the bustling distractions of the day. You might find yourself sketching bizarre creatures inspired by half-remembered dreams, or planning out the complex perspective of a grand scene entirely from your imagination, illuminated only by a hesitant flame. There's a certain romanticism to the idea of the lone artist toiling through the night, but the reality was likely far less glamorous: exhaustion, eye strain, and the pervasive smell of hot wax and animal byproducts. It was a grind, and every now and then, that grind would force your head to droop, your hand to still, and you'd find yourself slipping into a brief, unscheduled slumber, perhaps dreaming of a world with electric lights. You'd wake with a start, a slight crick in your neck, and the realization that the candle had burned down even further, reminding you that dawn in proper light was still hours away. Beyond the sun's schedule and the glow of a few candles, another relentless force shaped the Renaissance artist's life, and consequently their brief moments of rest. Patrons' demands. You weren't just painting for yourself. You were often working under contract for powerful, wealthy individuals, a duke, a cardinal, a wealthy merchant, or even the Pope himself. These patrons weren't known for their patience. They wanted their commissions finished, and they wanted them yesterday, usually with an impossible deadline attached. Imagine the pressure: a masterpiece for a grand cathedral, a portrait of a noble family, or an entire fresco cycle, all due before the next major feast day, or perhaps, even worse, before a rival patron unveiled their latest acquisition. This meant punishing schedules were the norm. You'd find yourself working from dawn till dusk, then pushing into those nocturnal hours we just discussed, all to satisfy the unyielding will of someone who held your livelihood and perhaps your artistic reputation in their hands. There were no sick days or mental health breaks in these contracts. You either delivered, or you risked losing future commissions, falling out of favor, and seeing your artistic career plummet faster than a dropped chisel. Historians still argue whether this intense pressure honed artistic skill through sheer repetition and focus, or if it led to hurried work and artistic burnout. You can almost feel the gnawing anxiety in your stomach as a patron's messenger arrived, not with payment, but with an urgent message. His Eminence desires the Madonna finished by Vespers. Sometimes these patrons would even come to the studio themselves, not just to check on progress, but to offer suggestions, which often sounded more like commands. Imagine trying to catch a quick nap when you knew at any moment a powerful, potentially displeased patron could sweep through the door, judging your progress or lack thereof. This constant oversight added another layer of stress, making any rest a furtive, almost illicit act. You might find yourself feigning intense concentration on a detail while secretly just trying to keep your eyes open. This was before the days of project management software or client relations, so everything was personal, direct, and often incredibly demanding. The artist therefore became a master of efficiency, trying to squeeze every last drop of productive time out of the day. But even the most dedicated artist is still human. Fatigue is an undeniable force. So while you might be racing against the clock to finish the intricate folds of a saint's robe or the complex musculature of a mythological hero, your body would eventually demand its due. A brief slump onto a nearby bench, your head resting on your paint-stained arm, might be the only option. These weren't luxurious siestas. They were survival naps, snatched moments of unconsciousness that allowed you to reset just enough to pick up the brush again. Think of it as the ultimate power nap fueled by desperation and the fear of an angry patron. And you'd wake with a start, the image of your unfinished work, and the looming deadline flashing through your mind, urging you back to the easel, just as you remember that rather inconvenient fact about a certain pope's fondness for promptness. If you thought the master artist had it tough, spare a thought for your apprentice's burden. You as a young aspiring artist would likely have entered a master's studio at an alarmingly young age, perhaps as young as 7 or 8. Your life would immediately become a relentless cycle of chores, menial tasks, and the constant hope of one day being allowed to touch a real paintbrush. This wasn't some romantic art school. It was more like an indentured servitude, a tough apprenticeship designed to break you down and then build you back up, hopefully into a skilled artisan. Your day would start even before the masters fetching water, stoking fires, sweeping floors, and perhaps most infamously grinding pigments. Imagine hours spent with a pestle and mortar, crushing minerals like lapis lazuli or malachite into fine powders, your hands aching, your clothes stained with vibrant, sometimes toxic dust. This was a crucial but incredibly tedious job. You were also responsible for preparing panels, stretching canvases, cleaning brushes, and running endless errands, often through bustling, dirty streets. There was no idle time for an apprentice. Every moment was filled with some task, big or small, designed to keep the studio running smoothly. Historians still argue whether this rigorous hands-on training produced more disciplined artists than modern academic methods. You, however, probably wouldn't care much about the debate. You just want 5 minutes to yourself. The sheer physical exhaustion of this lifestyle made stolen moments of sleep incredibly precious. You'd snatch a nap whenever and wherever you could get it, perhaps leaning against a cool stone wall while the master was distracted with a patron, or perhaps tucked away in a corner amidst a pile of discarded rags, hoping no one would notice your brief disappearance. These weren't comfortable naps. They were often contorted, uncomfortable affairs born purely out of necessity. Your bed, if you even had one beyond a straw pallet in a cramped attic, might feel a million miles away during the peak of the workday. You might even have developed an uncanny ability to sleep through chaos. The clang of tools, the chatter of visitors, even the master's booming voice. It was a survival skill. And when the master did take a nap, as we've already discussed, it was probably a moment of quiet relief for you too, a brief reprieve from constant scrutiny, allowing you a moment to rest your own weary eyes even if you couldn't fully close them. These young apprentices were the unsung heroes of the Renaissance art world, their tireless labor enabling the masters to create their iconic works. But beneath the veneer of artistic grandeur, you'd find a kid who was probably just perpetually tired, dreaming of the day they could finally afford their own comfortable bed and maybe take a nap without fear of being caught. It probably felt like a grand conspiracy, this whole secret napping thing, a quiet rebellion against the relentless demands of the studio. Now let's talk about the absolute lack of creature comforts in a typical Renaissance studio. You might imagine opulent spaces filled with plush, velvet chairs and soft divans, perfect for a luxurious afternoon snooze. The reality, however, was starkly different. Comfort's scarcity was a pervasive issue, making any ideal napping spot a rare and highly prized commodity. Forget ergonomic chairs or padded surfaces. You'd be lucky to find anything softer than a splintery wooden bench or a pile of dusty paint-splattered rags. Studios were designed for work, not for lounging. The floors were typically hard-packed earth or cold stone, which certainly wouldn't invite a cozy sprawl. Furniture, if present beyond workbenches and easels, was rudimentary, simple wooden stools, perhaps a sturdy table, all built for utility rather than ease. Imagine trying to catch some Z's leaning against a rough brick wall or attempting to balance precariously on a backless stool while your eyelids grew heavy. It was hardly conducive to deep restorative sleep. Historians still argue whether the physical discomfort of these environments forced artists to develop a greater mental fortitude or simply resulted in chronic back pain and a constant low-level grumpiness. You, however, would probably just long for a pillow, any pillow, even a lumpy one. This lack of comfortable spaces meant that artists and apprentices became incredibly adept at napping in the most unlikely positions and places. You might find a master dozing off, standing up leaning against an easel, his head resting lightly on a canvas. Apprentices might curl up under a workbench, nestled amongst discarded wood shavings and paint pots, hoping to avoid detection. These weren't power naps in the modern sense, carefully timed and strategically deployed. They were desperate measures, involuntary surrenders to overwhelming fatigue. Think of it as spontaneous human hibernation, brought on by sheer exhaustion and the absence of anything resembling a couch. The very tools of the trade often became makeshift napping aids. A sturdy wooden crate, usually used for storing supplies, could be flipped on its side and used as a pillow. A large rolled-up canvas, though probably a bit lumpy, might offer a surprisingly soft surface for a weary head. Even a pile of old sketches, while not exactly luxurious, would be better than nothing at all. You'd learn to appreciate any small patch of relative softness or warmth. Remember that persistent dampness and cold we'll discuss later. That would make finding a dry, warm spot for a nap an even greater challenge. So while we might romanticize the image of a genius lost in thought, the truth is they were probably just trying to find a semi-comfortable spot to rest their weary bones, even if that meant contorting themselves into a human pretzel on a pile of something slightly less hard than stone. And if you happen to fall asleep with your face in a puddle of turpentine, well, that's just part of the artistic journey, right? Probably not. While the discomfort of the studio certainly played a role in forcing spontaneous naps, there was another far more insidious factor at play: the chemical fumes. You might imagine a sweet, earthy smell of fresh paint, but the reality was often far more pungent, even dangerous. Renaissance artists weren't working with pre-mixed, non-toxic acrylics. They were mixing their own paints from raw pigments, many of which contained heavy metals and volatile organic compounds that would send a modern-day health and safety inspector running for the hills. Think about the ingredients: lead white for highlights, cinnabar mercuric sulfide; for brilliant reds, arsenic trisulfide; for vibrant yellows, and copper-based pigments for greens and blues. These weren't just colors, they were finely ground poisons. You'd be crushing them, mixing them with linseed oil or egg tempera, and then applying them often in poorly ventilated spaces. The dust from the pigments, the solvents used for cleaning brushes, like turpentine, a strong irritant, and the fumes from varnishes would all contribute to a cocktail of airborne toxins. Historians still argue whether the long-term exposure to these chemicals contributed to the eccentricities or early deaths of some famous masters, but you can be sure they had immediate effects. Imagine working for hours breathing in microscopic particles of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Your head would start to feel heavy, a dull ache behind your eyes might set in, and a pervasive lethargy could creep over you. This wasn't just tiredness. It was a physical response to the chemicals entering your system. Drowsiness, dizziness, and even nausea were common symptoms of acute exposure. You might find yourself feeling inexplicably sleepy, your movements slowing, your focus wavering, until you simply couldn't keep your eyes open any longer. A nap in this context wouldn't be a luxury. It would be your body's way of shutting down, trying to process and recover from the low-level poisoning it was enduring. It's even possible that some of these naps weren't entirely voluntary, but rather brief periods of light unconsciousness induced by the fumes. You might slump over your work only to snap awake a few minutes later, disoriented but perhaps temporarily clearer-headed. This brings a whole new, slightly alarming meaning to the term getting lost in your work, doesn't it? The air quality in these studios was probably akin to a modern-day industrial site without proper ventilation. There were no respirators, no fume hoods, no strict guidelines for handling hazardous materials. The artists were simply doing what they had always done, often unaware of the silent, invisible threats lurking in their paints. It's a sobering thought, really, that some of the most beautiful art ever created was born from an environment that was slowly, subtly making its creators sick. So the next time you admire a vibrant Renaissance red, remember that it might just have been painted by an artist whose nap wasn't entirely of their own choosing, but rather a chemical-induced respite. Beyond the artists themselves, another group of individuals in the studio contributed to the overall atmosphere of fatigue and occasionally shared in the involuntary napping, the model's exhaustion. You see, to create those lifelike portraits and dynamic historical scene, Artists needed human references. And back then, there were no cameras for quick snapshots, no digital models to manipulate. You relied on live models often for hours on end to achieve the intricate detail and realistic poses that define Renaissance art. Imagine yourself as a model. You'd be asked to hold a specific pose, perhaps a dramatic gesture, a serene expression, or an incredibly uncomfortable twisted position for extended periods. We're talking minutes that felt like hours, maybe even an entire afternoon. Your muscles would ache, your limbs would cramp, and your eyes, if you were meant to stare fixedly at something, would begin to water and blur. This wasn't a quick photo shoot. It was a grueling test of endurance. Historians still argue whether the stoic expressions often seen in Renaissance portraits were a reflection of inner piety or simply the model trying desperately to hold still while battling the urge to scream in discomfort. You, however, would probably just be praying for the artist to say rest. The artist intensely focused on capturing every nuance might not even notice your discomfort until you started to visibly sway or your expression began to crumble. You'd be standing, sitting, or even lying in one position sometimes with heavy drapery or props under the unwavering gaze of the artist, who might be muttering to themselves about light, shadow, and proportion. It was a silent, often tedious collaboration. The heat from the studio, the stillness required, and the sheer mental effort of maintaining a pose would undoubtedly lead to a profound sense of weariness. It wasn't uncommon for models, particularly those in less dynamic poses, to eventually nod off themselves. A slight slump of the shoulders, a gentle tilt of the head, a barely perceptible change in breathing, these could all be signs that your model had succumbed to the overwhelming desire for a quick doze. And when your model falls asleep, what do you, the artist, do? You might try to rouse them, or you might realize that their unconscious repose actually offers a new interesting angle for your composition. More likely seeing their exhaustion and feeling your own, you might decide it's an opportune moment for a shared break, perhaps even joining them in a brief if unsynchronized studio nap. It's a moment of shared human vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the physical toll art demanded from everyone involved. Perhaps that slight smile on the Mona Lisa isn't a secret, but simply the subtle hint of a model trying desperately not to fall asleep. As many Renaissance artists matured, their careers often involved a journey known as the paint-splattered Grand Tour's toll. This wasn't a leisurely vacation. It was a grueling, often perilous expedition undertaken by aspiring and established artists alike, primarily to study classical art and architecture in Italy. You'd pack up your meager belongings, perhaps a few sketchbooks and some charcoal, and set off on foot by unreliable horse or on crowded, disease-ridden ships. The roads were often little more than muddy tracks infested with bandits, and inns were rarely more than flea-bitten hovels offering stale bread and dubious wine. Imagine trudging for days, sometimes weeks, across mountain passes and through dusty plains. The physical exertion alone would be immense. You'd be exposed to the elements, scorching sun, chilling rain, biting winds, and sanitation was practically non-existent. Sleep would be a luxury, snatched in uncomfortable, unfamiliar surroundings, often shared with strangers and livestock. You'd wake up stiff, sore, and probably covered in insect bites, only to face another day of relentless travel. Historians still argue whether the hardships endured on these tours tempered the artist's spirits, preparing them for the rigors of commissions, or simply left them perpetually exhausted and susceptible to illness. You, however, would likely just be dreaming of a soft bed and a hot meal. This constant state of travel-induced fatigue made quick naps an absolute necessity, not a choice. You might find yourself dozing off in the back of a creaking cart, your head bobbing with every jolt, or slumping against a church wall during a midday rest stop. The artistic hunger to see Rome, to study the masterpieces of antiquity, and the burgeoning wonders of the High Renaissance propelled you forward, but your body had its limits. Even when you finally reached your destination, say the bustling streets of Rome or Florence, the work of studying, sketching, and absorbing new ideas was relentless, compounding the existing travel fatigue. The sensory overload of new cities, the constant stimulation, and the pressure to learn as much as possible in a limited time would add to the mental exhaustion. You might spend all day drawing ruins in the form, then return to cramped lodgings to meticulously copy drawings by old masters under flickering candlelight. This kind of schedule leaves little room for proper rest, making the lure of a sudden deep sleep almost irresistible. You'd probably collapse onto any available surface, whether a dusty stone bench in a piazza or a pile of your own rolled-up travel clothes for a few moments of blissful unconsciousness. These weren't power naps, they were survival naps, brief surrenders to the sheer weight of exhaustion, allowing you to just about keep going before the next leg of your artistic pilgrimage. It's a wonder any of them made it back to their studios in one piece, let alone with world-changing ideas in their heads. Just as the Grand Tour could leave an artist utterly depleted, the unpredictable nature of earning a living as a Renaissance creative also played a significant role in their fluctuating energy levels, leading to feast and famine cycles. You see, being an artist wasn't always a steady paycheck. Commissions could be grand and lucrative, but they were often sporadic. You might be working tirelessly for months on a massive fresco, bringing in a good income only for the project to suddenly conclude, leaving you with no immediate work lined up. This meant periods of intense nonstop labor, often fueled by the promise of significant payment, followed by lulls where work was scarce and money even scarcer. During the feast times, you'd push yourself to the absolute limit, working long hours, perhaps even sleeping in the studio to maximize productivity and secure your earnings. The pressure to complete a commission on time and to a high standard was immense, as your reputation and future livelihood depended on it. You'd burn the candle at both ends, knowing that this burst of activity needed to sustain you through the leaner times. Historians still argue whether this boom and bust cycle fostered resilience in artists or simply led to chronic stress and instability. You, however, would likely just be trying to make hay while the sun shone, literally. Then would come the famine periods. Commissions would dry up, patrons would be slow to pay, or perhaps you'd be between major projects. During these times, income might dwindle to almost nothing. While this might sound like an opportunity for rest, the reality was often the opposite. Anxiety about money would gnaw at you. You might spend your days seeking new patrons, networking, or engaging in smaller, less fulfilling tasks just to put food on the table. Even without the physical demands of constant painting, the mental burden of financial insecurity could be incredibly draining. You might find yourself tossing and turning at night, worried about how you'd pay for supplies or feed your family. Paradoxically, these periods of lower physical labor could still lead to exhaustion, making a daytime nap a welcome, if often guilty, escape. The lack of structured work could lead to irregular routines, and the stress of uncertainty could be more tiring than physical exertion. Imagine the relief of a short, deep sleep when your mind was otherwise racing with worries about the next meal. These naps weren't about recharging from intense work. They were often about finding a moment of mental peace, a brief escape from the anxieties of a precarious existence. So whether you were working like a madman to meet a deadline, or fretting about where the next commission would come from, the Renaissance artist's life was rarely conducive to consistent, restful sleep, making those impromptu studio snoozes an understandable, if often unscheduled, part of the creative process. While the struggles of the average Renaissance artist were undeniable, some figures stood out not just for their genius, but for their highly individual and sometimes peculiar approaches to work and rest. We're talking about the master's eccentricities. You see, not all masters were relentlessly disciplined workhorses. Some, like the legendary Leonardo da Vinci, were known for highly unconventional work habits that would undoubtedly have involved irregular sleep patterns, perhaps even incorporating deliberate short naps. Leonardo, for instance, was a polymath of astounding breadth, constantly flitting between painting, sculpture, engineering, anatomy, and countless other disciplines. His notebooks reveal a mind that was always exploring, always questioning. He was known for working in bursts of intense creativity, sometimes spending days meticulously observing a bird in flight or dissecting a cadaver, only to then abandon a painting for weeks, sometimes years. This wasn't laziness, it was a different kind of focus, a deep immersion that defied conventional scheduling. Historians still argue whether his fragmented approach to projects was a sign of restless genius or a frustrating lack of commitment for his patrons. You, as his apprentice, might have found it both awe-inspiring and incredibly annoying. This erratic creative rhythm meant that Leonardo reportedly practiced polyphasic sleep, taking multiple short naps throughout the day instead of one long nocturnal sleep. While the exact details are debated, the idea is that he would sleep for perhaps 20 minutes every 4 hours, allowing him to stay awake and productive for much longer stretches than a conventional sleeper. Imagine him mid-sketch simply slumping over his drawing board for a brief, intense doze, only to spring back to life moments later refreshed and ready to tackle the next intricate detail of a flying machine or the subtle smile of a portrait subject. This kind of sleep schedule would have been an extreme example of studio napping, not just a response to exhaustion, but a deliberate, almost scientific approach to maximizing his waking hours. Michelangelo, on the other hand, was famously obsessed with his work, particularly his sculpture. He was known to sleep in his clothes sometimes, even inside the quarry near the marble blocks he was carving, to save time and remain close to his beloved stone. For him, a nap might have been a brief, uncomfortable doze against a cold marble block, fueled by sheer exhaustion and an unyielding drive to bring his artistic vision to life. His dedication was legendary, bordering on the fanatical. You can picture him covered in marble dust, snatching a few minutes of sleep right there, amidst the chips and tools, only to be roused by the next glimmer of an idea. These aren't just stories. They reveal that for some masters, the studio wasn't just a workplace. It was an extension of their very being, a place where the boundaries between life work and even sleep became wonderfully, wonderfully blurred. Beyond the demanding patrons and personal eccentricities, a far more ominous shadow frequently crept into the Renaissance studio, undoubtedly affecting sleep patterns and daily routines, the omnipresent threat of plague's shadow. You see, the Renaissance wasn't just a period of artistic flourishing. It was also a time when devastating epidemics, most notably the bubonic plague, regularly swept through cities, wiping out huge swathes of the population. Imagine the fear, a cough, a fever, the telltale buboes appearing on a neighbor, and suddenly the entire city would descend into panic. People would flee, quarantine measures would be imposed, often ineffectively, and the normal rhythms of life would grind to a terrifying halt. For an artist, this meant a sudden cessation of commissions, a loss of patrons, and the very real danger of succumbing to the disease themselves. Studios would empty, apprentices would scatter, and the vibrant artistic life of a city could be snuffed out in a matter of weeks. Historians still argue about the exact demographic impact of the plague on the artistic community, but you can be certain it brought immense disruption and profound anxiety. In such times, sleep would be deeply affected. The constant fear of contagion, the grief for lost loved ones, and the disruption of daily life would make restful sleep incredibly difficult. You might find yourself tossing and turning at night, listening to the death carts roll by, or watching desperately for any sign of illness in yourself or your family. During the day, the studio might be eerily silent, devoid of the usual bustle, leaving you alone with your thoughts and anxieties. This mental strain is profoundly exhausting, often more so than physical labor. If you were fortunate enough to survive a plague outbreak, you would emerge from it shaken and weary. The immediate aftermath would be marked by a sense of profound relief, but also by the quiet trauma of what you had witnessed. Work might resume, but the underlying anxiety would linger. The scarcity of labor due to deaths could mean increased demands on surviving artists, pushing them to work even harder to meet the needs of a recovering populace, compounding their exhaustion. Or conversely, a lack of available patrons could lead to periods of forced inactivity, leaving you with little to do but worry. In either scenario, the pervasive fatigue, whether from fear or overwork, would make spontaneous naps a frequent occurrence. You might find yourself drifting off simply to escape the grim reality outside the studio walls, finding temporary solace in unconsciousness, praying that you wouldn't wake up to a new set of symptoms. The plague didn't just kill, it left a deep, lingering exhaustion in its wake, permeating every aspect of life, including the elusive peace of sleep. Beyond the looming specter of disease, the very fabric of daily life in the Renaissance was interwoven with religious observances, which could profoundly impact an artist's sleep and work rhythms. You see, this was a profoundly religious era, and the church dictated not just moral codes, but also the practical calendar of the year. There were numerous holy days, fast days, and periods of solemn observance that punctuated the typical work week, often in ways that would baffle a modern schedule planner. Imagine preparing for a major feast day like Easter or Christmas. These weren't just days off. They involved special services, often extending late into the night, and periods of fasting or abstinence leading up to them. If you were a devout artist or simply one who lived in a community where religious traditions were strictly observed, you might find your sleep cycle disrupted by early morning mass, late night vigils, or the general communal anticipation of a holy event. The physical and mental discipline of fasting, for instance, could leave you feeling weak and drained, making the lure of a quick nap even stronger. Historians still argue whether the spiritual focus of these observances enhanced artistic creativity or simply served as inconvenient breaks in productivity. You, however, would likely just be trying to stay awake during the homily after a night of prayer and a day of fasting. Conversely, some religious periods could bring a surge of commissions. Holy images for new altar pieces, frescoes for newly consecrated chapels, or processional banners. These all meant intense bursts of work leading up to a specific religious event. This often translated into artists pushing themselves to their absolute limits, working round the clock to meet an unyielding deadline dictated by the liturgical calendar. You'd be painting furiously, knowing that failure to deliver before, say, the Feast of the Annunciation was not just a professional failure, but almost a spiritual affront. This kind of intense pressure would inevitably lead to crashes of exhaustion, where a spontaneous nap in the studio became less about leisure and more about sheer survival. Then there were the periods of solemnity, like Lent, when certain forms of entertainment or indulgence were curtailed. While this might not directly impact physical sleep, the altered social rhythm and contemplative mood could certainly affect energy levels and routines. The overall communal shift towards reflection and austerity might create a quiet atmosphere in the studio, perhaps even inviting a momentary respite. So whether it was the physical demands of long religious services, the mental strain of fasting, or the intense pressure of a religiously mandated deadline, the rhythm of faith often created the perfect conditions for an artist to succumb to a brief restorative doze, right there amidst their holy creations. After all, even the most pious artists needed to recharge their spirit and their body sometimes with a quick, unscheduled journey to dreamland. While the intellectual pursuits and grand commissions of the Renaissance often get the spotlight, of far more fundamental and pervasive issues silently contributed to artists seeking warmth and rest. Drafts and dampness. You see, heating technology was rudimentary at best. Studios were often large open spaces built for light more than comfort, and effective insulation was practically non-existent. Forget central heating or even robust fireplaces in every room. You were at the mercy of the elements, and in much of Italy, that meant damp, chilly winters and often cool, breezy nights, even in warmer months. Imagine the pervasive chill that would seep into your bones as you worked. Large unglazed windows, or windows fitted with thin rattling panes of glass, would let in a constant stream of cold air. Stone walls, while sturdy, would hold the damp and cold, radiating a constant chill. Fireplaces, if present, were often inefficient, belching more smoke than heat, and offering warmth only in their immediate vicinity. You'd find yourself huddled close to the meager flames, if any, or perhaps bundled in layers of wool and linen, trying to ward off the incessant shivers. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of respiratory ailments among Renaissance artists was due to poor ventilation, the cold, or a combination of both. You, however, would simply feel perpetually cold. This constant exposure to cold and damp would lead to a persistent physical fatigue. Your body would expend extra energy just trying to stay warm, leaving you feeling drained even without strenuous activity. Cold fingers would make delicate brushwork difficult, and stiff joints would ache with every movement. In such an environment, the thought of finding a patch of sunlight or even a sheltered corner away from the worst of the drafts would be incredibly appealing. A brief nap in a slightly warmer spot, even if still chilly, would offer a moment of respite, allowing your body to conserve energy and momentarily escape the cold. You might find artists huddling together for warmth, sharing body heat as they discuss their work. The very act of staying still while painting, particularly for extended periods, would make you feel the cold more acutely. So while you're meticulously applying a glaze to a fresco, you might find your mind wandering to the idea of a quick escape into unconsciousness just to get away from the gnawing chill. The dampness, too, was a constant companion, especially in cities like Venice or Florence, where the canals and rivers contributed to the pervasive moisture in the air. This dampness would penetrate clothing, make materials slow to dry, and generally add to the uncomfortable atmosphere. So next time you admire a luminous Renaissance painting, consider the artist who might have been shivering while they worked, longing for a moment of warmth, even if that warmth came only in the form of a brief, chilly, yet restorative studio nap. It's a testament to their dedication that they could create such beauty under such persistently uncomfortable conditions. Beyond the physical discomforts and the external demands, the very layout and function of Renaissance studios created a unique environment for the informal, nap-and-shared spaces. You might envision a lone genius toiling in splendid isolation, but the reality was often far more communal. Studios were rarely private sanctuaries. They were bustling hubs of activity often shared by the master, multiple apprentices, and sometimes even other journeymen or specialists. Imagine stepping into such a space. You'd hear the rhythmic scraping of chisels, the gentle swish of brushes, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional clang of tools. Apprentices would be grinding pigments in one corner, a journeyman might be preparing a canvas in another, and the master might be dictating instructions while sketching out a new composition. This was a true workshop, a collaborative environment where art was a collective endeavor, even if the final masterpiece bore only the master's name. Historians still argue whether this constant interaction fostered greater artistic exchange or simply led to more distractions. You, however, would simply have to navigate the constant ebb and flow of people and activity. In such a busy, often cramped environment, privacy for napping was an absolute luxury. There were no dedicated break rooms, no quiet corners specifically designed for rest. If you needed to sleep, you did so where you were amidst the ongoing work. This meant developing an incredible ability to tune out the surrounding noise and activity. You might find yourself dozing off right beside a noisy workbench or leaning against a wall where an apprentice was diligently mixing paints. It was a testament to the sheer exhaustion that artists could find sleep in such chaotic conditions. The very act of sharing a space also created an unspoken understanding. Everyone was working long, hard hours. Everyone was tired. So if you saw a fellow artist or apprentice nodding off, there was a tacit agreement not to disturb them unless absolutely necessary. It was a shared burden, and shared moments of respite were often respected. You might even find a sense of quiet solidarity in these shared naps, a brief, wordless connection between weary souls. Perhaps that's why we don't hear more about artists complaining about their colleagues' napping habits. They were probably too busy planning their own. These shared spaces also meant that the entire atmosphere of the studio could shift. A momentary lull in activity, perhaps when everyone was engrossed in a particularly challenging detail, or waiting for a layer of paint to dry, could create an almost magnetic pull towards sleep. Suddenly, the rhythmic sounds of work could transform into a soothing lullaby, inviting you to close your eyes, if only for a few minutes. It was a fascinating blend of constant activity and surprising moments of shared communal stillness, all punctuated by the occasional gentle snore. Beyond the physical demands and communal dynamics, the very nature of the creative process itself contributed to the unpredictable sleep patterns, often inviting a spontaneous studio nap point. Inspiration's whim. You see, artistic creativity isn't a tap you can simply turn on and off at will. It's an elusive, often frustrating force, and sometimes the best way to court it is to step away to let your mind wander, or even famously to sleep on it. Imagine staring at a half-finished canvas, grappling with a complex compositional problem, or trying to capture the elusive light on a saint's halo. Hours might pass, your mind circling the same problem, your hand hovering, unable to make the decisive stroke. This isn't physical exhaustion, but a profound mental fatigue, a creative block that drains your energy as effectively as any manual labor. In these moments, pushing harder often makes things worse. You might find yourself pacing, sighing, or simply slumping onto a nearby bench, hoping a change of scenery, even if it's just the inside of your eyelids, will clear your head. Historians still argue whether forcing through creative blocks produces more resilient artists or simply leads to artistic frustration and less inspired work. You, however, would likely just be praying for a breakthrough or at least a few minutes of blessed unconsciousness. Conversely, inspiration could strike at the most inconvenient times. Perhaps a flash of insight late at night or a new idea blossoming after hours of frustration. This could lead to a sudden burst of intense work fueled by the sheer excitement of a fresh perspective. You might find yourself working furiously, driven by the muse, oblivious to the passage of time or the growing fatigue. But just as intensely as inspiration arrives, it can also recede, leaving you utterly drained in its wake. After such a creative high, a crash is almost inevitable, and a nap becomes a natural, almost necessary consequence. This meant that an artist's sleep patterns were rarely regular. They were dictated by the ebb and flow of ideas, the intensity of their creative engagement, and the sudden appearance or disappearance of that elusive spark. A particularly challenging piece might demand days of relentless focus, followed by a period of complete mental exhaustion where all you could do was rest. You might also find that stepping away even for a short doze allowed your subconscious mind to work on the problem, delivering a solution upon waking. This phenomenon, often called incubation, suggests that the brain continues to process information even during rest, sometimes leading to breakthroughs. So for a Renaissance artist, a nap wasn't just about physical rest. It was often a strategic retreat, a quiet surrender that paradoxically fueled their greatest leaps of artistic imagination, delivering a moment of clarity as fresh as that first breath of cool air after a long, stuffy session. Building on the idea of inspiration's whimsical nature, some Renaissance artists, much like modern creatives, seem to intuitively understand the power of the subconscious mind, leading to practices that resemble a primitive form of dream journaling. You see, while we don't have extensive records of detailed dream analyses from every Renaissance studio, the period was deeply fascinated by symbolism, allegory, and the unseen realms. Dreams were often seen not just as random mental flickers, but as potential messages, premonitions, or even divine inspiration. Imagine an artist grappling with a complex mythological scene, a religious vision, or a terrifying depiction of hell. The imagery required wasn't always readily available in the physical world. Where did the grotesque figures of demons come from, or the ethereal glow of an angel? Sometimes perhaps from the fertile ground of their own sleeping minds. You might find yourself after a particularly intense period of work or a stress-induced nap waking with a vivid fleeting image in your mind. A peculiar face, a strange landscape, a dynamic pose you hadn't considered. The immediacy of the Renaissance artist's work-life setup meant that a sketchbook was often just an arm's reach away, allowing for these ephemeral visions to be captured before they vanished. Historians still argue whether artists consciously sought inspiration from their dreams or if these were simply happy accidents of an overworked mind. You, however, might have felt a sudden urgency to scribble down that bizarre, half-forgotten image before it slipped away entirely. This isn't to say Renaissance artists were all practicing Freudian analysis on their night terrors, but rather that the line between waking artistic thought and subconscious imagery might have been remarkably fluid. A nap, even a short one, could provide a fertile ground for these subconscious thoughts to coalesce. Your mind, freed from the immediate demands of the physical world, might process accumulated ideas, anxieties, or observations, presenting them in new, often symbolic forms. Think of it as your internal projector running a surreal, silent movie and then delivering a few key frames upon waking. The very act of napping in the studio, surrounded by your work tools, and the very subjects you were contemplating would only enhance this connection. You might fall asleep, staring at a partially rendered face, and then, in your brief doze, your mind would somehow solve a problem of expression or proportion. Waking up perhaps a little disoriented, you'd feel a sudden clarity and urge to immediately pick up your brush or charcoal and capture the freshly formed idea. This subtle interplay between waking effort and subconscious processing, often facilitated by a brief period of rest, could have been an unacknowledged yet powerful source of innovation. So that next time you admire a particularly imaginative or dreamlike quality in a Renaissance masterpiece, you might just be looking at the fleeting residue of an artist's profound, if accidental, studio nap, a glimpse into the bizarre and brilliant world of their sleeping mind. Let's turn our attention to another powerful, if often overlooked, contributor to the Renaissance artist's propensity for napping: food and drink's influence. You see, meals back then, especially for those who could afford them, weren't the light, hurried affairs we often experience today. They could be substantial, rich, and often accompanied by a generous quantity of wine. Imagine a midday meal for a successful master and his apprentices, heavy stews, roasted meats, thick bread, and plenty of local vino. This kind of hearty meal, particularly in an era before coffee became widely available as a stimulant, was a recipe for the dreaded post-lunch slump. You'd feel your stomach grow heavy, your blood flow diverting to your digestive system, and a profound lethargy would begin to creep over you. The warmth of the studio combined with the caloric density of the meal would create a powerful soporific effect. It was almost impossible to resist the urge to simply close your eyes even for a few minutes. Historians still argue whether the dietary habits of the time genuinely led to a less productive afternoon or simply forced a necessary, if unspoken, midday break. You, however, would likely just feel your eyelids getting heavier and heavier. Wine, of course, played its part. While perhaps not consumed to the point of outright intoxication during the workday, even a moderate amount of wine with a meal could contribute to drowsiness. It was a common beverage, often safer to drink than water, and a staple of most meals. The relaxing effects of the alcohol combined with a full stomach would only deepen the postprandial stupor. You might find yourself listening to the gentle murmur of conversation, the sounds of the bustling city outside and slowly irrevocably drifting off. This wasn't about laziness. It was a perfectly natural physiological response. The body, having just completed a significant digestive task, craves rest. For an artist whose work demanded sharp focus and steady hands, pushing through this wave of drowsiness might have been counterproductive. A short nap could actually serve as a reset, allowing them to return to their work refreshed and more focused. Think of it as an organic pre-caffeine power-up, albeit one that involved a temporary surrender to the Sandman. You might even discover that some artists deliberately indulged in a slightly heavier meal, knowing that the ensuing drowsiness would force them into a short nap, which they then leveraged for creative problem-solving upon waking, much like our discussion of dream journaling. It's a rather delightful image, isn't it? A great master, having just consumed a plate of hearty stew and a goblet of Chianti, succumbing to the blissful embrace of a studio snooze, only to wake with a brilliant new idea for a fresco. Cheers to that and sweet dreams. In our modern world, we are slaves to the clock, meticulously scheduling every minute of our day. But for the Renaissance artist, life operated under a very different temporal framework, one deeply influencing their irregular rest patterns. No clocks yet. You see, while early mechanical clocks existed, they were rare, imprecise, and certainly not ubiquitous in every artist's studio or on every wrist. Timekeeping was largely approximate, dictated by natural rhythms, church bells, and the position of the sun. Imagine trying to keep a strict schedule when your primary time markers are the crow of a rooster, the changing light of the day, and the distant chimes of a church steeple marking the canonical hours. There was a more fluid, organic sense of time. Artists began work with the dawn, paused for midday meals, and stopped as darkness descended, as we've discussed with the influence of natural light. This meant that their internal body clocks, rather than external mechanical ones, likely played a much stronger role in dictating when they felt tired, when they felt energetic, and when they needed to rest. Historians still argue whether this less rigid time structure allowed for greater creative freedom or simply led to a more haphazard existence. You, however, would likely find yourself living much more by instinct. This lack of precise timekeeping meant that naps weren't scheduled events. They were responses to the body's natural fatigue signals. If you felt tired, you rested. If you woke up feeling refreshed after a short doze, you simply resumed work. There was no internal alarm clock yelling at you that your 20-minute power nap was over. This freedom from temporal tyranny could be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allowed for organic work rhythms that followed the flow of inspiration and energy. On the other hand, it might have contributed to erratic schedules where intense bursts of activity were followed by equally intense but unscheduled periods of exhaustion. Think about it: without a constant awareness of the exact hour, you might push yourself for what felt like an hour only to realize, perhaps by the setting sun, that it had been several. This time distortion could lead to sudden, overwhelming fatigue, making an immediate nap the most logical and often only recourse. The concept of efficiency was less about maximizing minutes and more about maximizing output. If a brief rest helped you produce better work, then it was a valuable use of time regardless of how long it lasted. So while we obsess over our smartwatches and digital calendars, the Renaissance artists relied on the more primal human rhythm of their own bodies, leading to a much more integrated and often nappy existence, where time was less a master and more a gentle guide, nudging them towards rest when their eyes grew heavy and their mind yearned for a brief escape. In the bustling shared environment of a Renaissance studio, the master's authority was paramount, but even that could be temporarily bypassed by the quiet conspiracy surrounding a much-needed nap. This brings us to the unsung role of the apprentice's lookout. You see, while apprentices were meant to be working diligently grinding pigments or preparing canvases, they also served as the master's eyes and ears, and sometimes his unwitting co-conspirators in the pursuit of rest. Imagine your master perhaps exhausted from a late-night drawing session or a heavy midday meal, finally succumbing to the undeniable urge for a nap. He might slump over a workbench, lean back in a rickety chair, or even just prop his head against a pile of canvases. This was a vulnerable moment for the master. Patrons could arrive unannounced, demanding updates. Fellow artists might drop by for a chat, and while a certain amount of artistic eccentricity was tolerated, a master caught openly napping might risk looking unprofessional or worse, lazy. Historians still argue whether this informal system of napping protection fostered a stronger bond between master and apprentice, or simply added another layer of responsibility to the apprentice's already grueling day. You, however, would know that a sleeping master meant a momentary reprieve for yourself and a crucial task to perform. Your unspoken duty as an apprentice would be to act as a silent sentinel. You'd keep one eye on the master and the other on the studio door. If a visitor approached, especially a potentially important or demanding one, you'd subtly but swiftly alert your master. Perhaps a strategically loud cough, the accidental dropping of a tool, or a quick hushed word. Anything to rouse him before he was caught mid-snore. It was a delicate dance requiring discretion and quick thinking. You wouldn't want to explicitly announce, "Master is napping, please wait," but rather create a plausible distraction that allowed him to snap awake and compose himself, appearing as though he'd merely been in deep contemplation. This shared secret created a unique bond, a quiet understanding between the exhausted master and his equally tired apprentice. It was a testament to the pervasive fatigue within these studios that such a system would even exist. The apprentice, knowing the immense pressure on the master, would understand the necessity of these brief respites, and in return perhaps the master would be slightly more lenient with his young charge. So while you were technically supposed to be working, a part of your brain would always be on lookout duty, listening for footsteps, the creak of the door, or the telltale murmur of voices approaching. It was a symbiotic relationship of exhaustion, where the apprentice safeguarded the master's rest, perhaps secretly hoping for their own chance to doze off once the coast was clear. And sometimes you'd even get to enjoy a few minutes of quiet yourself, as the master's snores provided a rhythmic backdrop to your own burgeoning drowsiness. Given the often chaotic communal nature of Renaissance studios, finding a moment of solitude, let alone a place for an undisturbed nap, was a true challenge. This brings us to the concept of artistic retreats. Those private corners or hidden nooks that artists might have carved out for themselves within the very heart of their workspaces. You see, while the main studio might have been a hive of activity every now and then, a savvy master or a particularly cunning apprentice might discover or create a spot just a little bit out of the way, a temporary sanctuary for a quick snooze. Imagine a small alcove where supplies were stored, perhaps tucked away behind a stack of canvases, or maybe a slightly elevated platform used for large-scale works where one could momentarily disappear from view. Even a large draped easel or a strategically placed screen could offer a semblance of privacy. These weren't luxurious fainting couches. They were often crude makeshift havens, chosen for their relative quiet and obscurity. You might find yourself squeezing into a space barely large enough for your body, hoping to be out of sight and out of mind for a few precious minutes. Historians still argue whether these hidden spots fostered introspection or simply allowed for more illicit napping. You, however, would likely just be grateful for any spot where you wouldn't be stepped on. The very act of seeking out such a spot suggests a conscious desire for rest, a recognition that the main studio environment, with its constant demands and activity, was not conducive to true recuperation. These were often the preferred spots for a power nap, a brief intense doze designed to refresh and re-energize without the need to leave the studio entirely. You'd likely develop an uncanny sense for the quietest times, the moments when the most noise-producing activities cease, creating a brief window of opportunity. Sometimes these retreats weren't just for sleeping, they might also serve as places for quiet contemplation, where an artist could step away from the physical act of painting and simply think. But inevitably, deep thought combined with the omnipresent fatigue could easily tip over into sleep. Perhaps you'd find a master lost in thought about a difficult composition, slowly drift off his hands still holding a charcoal stick, only to wake with a start, a fresh idea blossoming in his mind. These little hideaways, however humble, were crucial microenvironments within the larger studio ecosystem, offering not just a place to nap, but a brief psychological escape from the relentless demands of Renaissance artistic life. It's a reminder that even in the most communal settings, humans seek out small pockets of personal space, especially when sleep is calling your name louder than a patron demanding their portrait. The very act of taking a nap in the studio, especially for a master, wasn't just a private affair. It could become fodder for discussion, shaping rumors and reputations. You see, in the close-knit world of Renaissance, art word traveled fast. A master's habits, good or bad, were often whispered about among apprentices, debated by rival workshops, and sometimes even reached the ears of influential patrons. A reputation once earned could be hard to shake, and an artist's personal habits could be interpreted in many ways. Imagine the discussions: was a master's tendency to nap a sign of profound genius, a necessary retreat into the wellspring of creativity? Ah, Maestro Bellini. He merely closes his eyes to see the angels more clearly. Or was it viewed as indolence, a lack of discipline that bordered on disrespect for a patron's valuable commission? Old Master Rossi always napping. No wonder his frescoes are behind schedule. Historians still argue about how much these personal habits truly impacted an artist's public perception, but you can be sure that such details were noticed and discussed. You as an apprentice would certainly be aware of your master's habits and how they might be perceived by others. For some, particularly those who cultivated an air of mysterious genius, a spontaneous nap might even have been a performative act, a subtle way to suggest that their creative process was so intense, so demanding, that their bodies simply needed these moments of profound rest. Think of it as a subtle artistic flex. My mind is working so hard, I simply must shut down periodically to process the sheer brilliance. It's a far cry from confessing, I just ate a huge plate of pasta and I'm about to fall asleep. For others, especially if deadlines were looming or patrons were particularly demanding, a visible nap might have been a source of genuine concern or even embarrassment. The apprentice's role as lookout, as we discussed, becomes even more crucial in this context. Protecting the master's image was almost as important as protecting his physical rest. A well-timed cough could save a master's reputation as much as it saved him from a crick in the neck. The perception of napping could also vary culturally. In some regions, a midday siesta was a more accepted part of daily life, making a quick studio nap less remarkable. In others, it might have been seen as a sign of weakness or laziness. This cultural nuance would undoubtedly color how an artist's resting habits were interpreted. So the next time you look at a portrait of a Renaissance master with a particularly serene or contemplative expression, you might wonder if it's merely artistic idealization or if it's the subtle depiction of a mind that has just returned from a refreshing, if slightly scandalous studio, snooze ready to face the world and its judgments once more. Sometimes the act of napping in the studio wasn't a sign of creative genius or chemical fatigue, but a silent surrender to pure frustration. This brings us to the scenario of the unfinished masterpiece. You see, while we tend to focus on the completed works, many Renaissance artists grappled with projects that seemed insurmountable pieces that refused to yield to their vision, or moments when a creative block felt utterly impenetrable. Imagine spending days, weeks, even months on a single section of a fresco, a complex anatomical detail, or the intricate folds of a saint's drapery. You might try every technique, consult every drawing, and still the result doesn't match the image in your mind. The brush feels heavy, your hand loses its steady precision, and a profound sense of exasperation sets in. This isn't physical exhaustion from manual labor. It's the mental and emotional drain of creative struggle, a feeling of being utterly stuck. In these moments, forcing yourself to continue often proves futile, leading only to more frustration and potentially ruining the work. Historians still argue whether forcing through these difficult periods ultimately produced a stronger art, or if stepping away was always the wiser choice. You, however, would likely just feel like banging your head against a wall, preferably a soft one. When faced with such an impasse, a break becomes essential. And for a Renaissance artist in their studio, a break often meant a quick retreat into unconsciousness. You might simply drop your brush step back from the easel and slump onto the nearest surface, allowing your mind to switch off. This wasn't about avoiding work, it was about resetting your mental state. A brief nap could offer a crucial distance, allowing the subconscious to work on the problem, or simply providing enough rest for your conscious mind to return with a fresh perspective. You might wake with a sudden intuitive solution, or at least a renewed sense of patience and determination. Think of it as hitting the reset button on your brain. The frustration that seemed overwhelming just moments before might now appear manageable, the previously intractable problem suddenly yielding to a new approach. Perhaps that slight imperfection in a famous work isn't a mistake, but the mark of an artist who, after a refreshing studio nap, returned with a slightly different vision, a subtle shift that ultimately made the piece even more compelling. These moments of creative struggle, punctuated by the silent surrender to a nap, were a powerful, if often unacknowledged, part of the artistic process. It speaks volumes about the sheer mental fortitude required to create these masterpieces, and the very human need to sometimes just close your eyes and wish the problem away, even if only for a few minutes. In the often Spartan and practical world of a Renaissance artist's studio, true comfort was a rare commodity, especially when sleep called. This meant artists became incredibly resourceful, turning whatever was at hand into a temporary pillow. We're talking about tools as pillows, a testament to sheer exhaustion and the improvisational nature of their daily lives. Imagine an artist mid-project feeling the undeniable pull of sleep. There's no plush cushion or soft mattress readily available. Instead, they'd survey their immediate surroundings, quickly assessing what could offer even a modicum of support for a weary head. You might see a master artist, perhaps Leonardo or Michelangelo, after a grueling day slumping onto a large, sturdy wooden crate, typically used for transporting panels or storing pigments. The rough wood might not be comfortable, but it offered elevation and stability. Or perhaps a pile of discarded rags, paint-splattered and stiff with dried medium, but still softer than the cold stone floor. Historians still argue whether this constant discomfort fostered a more resilient artistic spirit or simply led to chronic neck pain. You, however, would simply appreciate any surface that wasn't actively trying to give you splinters. Sometimes the tools of their trade themselves became unlikely resting aids. A heavy rolled-up canvas, perhaps one waiting to be stretched, or a study that hadn't yet found its purpose, could be repurposed as a makeshift bolster. It might be lumpy and smell faintly of oil paint, but in the depths of exhaustion, it would feel like a cloud. You might even find an artist using a large, well-worn leather apron folded just so as a temporary cushion for their head, the familiar smell of their craft accompanying them into a brief slumber. The irony of using the very instruments of their tireless labor as tools for rest is quite poignant, isn't it? These weren't luxurious siestas. They were often uncomfortable, contorted affairs where the artist would wake with a crick in their neck and perhaps a faint imprint of a chisel handle on their cheek. But in those moments of overwhelming fatigue, any surface that offered a brief escape from upright consciousness was a blessing. It speaks volumes about the intensity of their work and the pervasive lack of amenities that artists would resort to such improvised measures. The studio wasn't just a place of creation, it was a microcosm of their entire existence, where every object, even the most mundane, could serve a dual purpose, transforming from tool to temporary pillow in the blink of a sleep-deprived eye. So the next time you visit a museum and see a magnificent Renaissance work, take a moment to consider the less glamorous realities of its creation, perhaps even imagining the artist dozing off on a pile of dusty old sketches, dreaming of a truly soft bed. In the bustling, often noisy environment of a Renaissance studio, there were rare, precious moments that invited an almost magnetic pull towards sleep, the advent of the silent studio. You see, while we've painted a picture of constant activity with apprentices, grinding masters, dictating, and patrons visiting, there were indeed fleeting periods when the usual cacophony would momentarily cease. These lulls were often accidental, a confluence of various factors, but when they occurred, they offered an irresistible opportunity for rest. Imagine the master stepping out for an errand, or perhaps attending to a client. The apprentices left unsupervised might seize the chance for a moment of quiet, perhaps even a whispered game or a secret bite of bread. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith next door might momentarily cease. The bustling street outside might experience a temporary lull in traffic. For a brief, blissful period, the studio would fall silent, or at least significantly quieter than its usual din. Historians still argue whether these quiet interludes were actively sought by artists or merely an unexpected perk of their chaotic work lives. You, however, would simply feel the sudden profound absence of noise, a stillness that seemed to beckon you toward slumber. This sudden quiet would have a powerful psychological effect. The constant stimulation of sounds and voices would vanish, allowing your tired mind to finally relax. The tension in your shoulders might ease, your breathing would deepen, and the omnipresent fatigue which you might have been pushing down would suddenly assert itself with full force. It's in these moments that you might find yourself instinctively seeking out a spot, any spot for a quick doze. The very air might seem to thicken with the potential for sleep. Perhaps the silence would be triggered by a period of waiting, waiting for a layer of paint to dry, waiting for a specific light condition, or simply waiting for a difficult decision to be made. During these passive periods when active work was impossible, the body and mind deprived of immediate tasks would naturally drift towards rest. You might find yourself gazing at your unfinished work, your thoughts slowing, and then without even realizing it, your eyes would close. The absence of external stimuli would make it easier to fall into a deep if short sleep. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest luxury isn't a soft bed, but simply the absence of noise and distraction. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of unexpected quiet, remember the Renaissance artist who, surrounded by their tools and masterpieces, might have just succumbed to the irresistible lull of a silent studio, finding a brief restorative escape in the unexpected calm before the storm of creation resumed. Beyond the daily grind and sporadic bursts of creativity, a particular kind of exhaustion would often sweep over Renaissance artists after a monumental effort, the Maison post-exhibition crash. You see, unlike today's continuous gallery rotations, Renaissance art was often unveiled at specific grand events: the completion of a major altarpiece for a cathedral, the installation of a fresco cycle in a palace, or perhaps a significant presentation to a powerful patron. Leading up to these unveilings, the pressure would be immense. Imagine the weeks, even months before such an event. You'd be working relentlessly, often around the clock, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer terror of missing a deadline. Every detail had to be perfect, every brushstroke precise. Apprentices would be working alongside you, equally exhausted as you push through the final stages. The studio would be a whirlwind of activity, tense and focused. Sleep would be a distant memory, sacrificed at the altar of artistic perfection and the patron's demanding schedule. You'd probably feel like a zombie running purely on fumes, and the promise of that glorious moment of unveiling. Historians still argue whether this intense, cyclical pattern of work enhanced the final product or simply pushed artists to their breaking point. You, however, would just be praying for it to be over. Then the moment would arrive. The work would be unveiled, the crowds would gasp, the patron would nod in approval, hopefully, and the critics, if they existed in their modern form, would offer their opinions. This moment, however triumphant, would be followed by an immediate, profound release of tension. The adrenaline would drain away, leaving behind an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. It's like running a marathon and then suddenly stopping. Your body simply collapses. This crash was often so severe that it would lead to extended periods of recovery sleep far longer than your typical studio nap. You might find yourself sleeping for an entire day or even more as your body finally allowed itself to process the immense physical and mental strain it had endured. The studio, once a frantic hive of activity, would fall eerily silent as its inhabitants recuperated. You might stumble out of bed days later feeling disoriented, but profoundly relieved that the ordeal was over. These weren't just short power naps. They were deep restorative slumbers, a necessary physiological consequence of sustained intense creative output. It's a powerful reminder that even the greatest artists capable of producing masterpieces that still awe us, centuries later, were ultimately flesh and blood, susceptible to the same human need for rest after pushing themselves to the absolute limit. Perhaps that final serene expression on a freshly unveiled Madonna wasn't just piety, but the artist's quiet longing for a very long nap. As we've explored the multifaceted reasons for Renaissance artists' studio naps, from chemical fumes to demanding patrons, it becomes clear that the concept of a creative nap is not a modern invention. This enduring practice speaks to the legacy of the nap, demonstrating how the need for brief restorative sleep has transcended centuries, connecting modern artists and creatives to their Renaissance predecessors. You see, while the tools and contexts have changed dramatically, the human brain embodies fundamental requirements for rest remain strikingly similar. Imagine a contemporary graphic designer hunched over a glowing screen, wrestling with a complex layout, or a modern sculptor working late into the night under bright studio lights, trying to perfect a difficult form. Just like their Renaissance counterparts, they push deadlines, battle creative blocks, and often find themselves working through profound exhaustion. And what do many of them do when the well of inspiration runs dry or their eyelids simply refuse to stay open? They take a nap. Perhaps it's a quick 20-minute power nap on a sofa, or even just slumping over their desk for a few minutes of quiet. Historians still argue about whether the formal recognition of power naps in modern productivity circles truly improves output or merely legitimizes what artists have always done. You, however, would likely just feel the familiar pull of sleep regardless of the century. The very idea that a short period of unconsciousness can lead to fresh insights, problem-solving, and renewed energy is a concept that has quietly persisted through the ages. Renaissance artists might not have had the scientific terminology of REM sleep or cognitive restoration, but they intuitively understood that sometimes the best way to move forward was to temporarily stop. The physical and mental demands of their craft, combined with the often harsh conditions of their studios, simply amplified this universal human need. Remember that specific kind of brain fog you get when you've been staring at a problem for too long? A nap, even a quick one, is often the only thing that can cut through it. So when you see images of famous Renaissance artists vibrant with energy and focus, remember the hidden truth: they were likely just as prone to the midday slump as you are after a heavy lunch. Their masterpieces were not only born from divine inspiration and rigorous training, but also quite possibly from the quiet moments of their unrecorded naps. This shared human experience of fatigue and the natural inclination to counter it with sleep forms an unexpected bridge across the centuries, linking the dusty, drafty studios of Florence to the brightly lit creative spaces of today. The artistic nap in its various forms remains a silent testament to the enduring rhythm of human creativity and the timeless need for a little bit of shut-eye, no matter how grand your artistic ambition. Having explored the often chaotic and demanding world of the Renaissance artist, it's clear that the idea of a scheduled, deliberate nap was rarely an option. Instead, they became masters of improvisation, turning whatever was at hand into a temporary respite. This brings us to a rather endearing detail: tools as pillows. You see, when sheer exhaustion hit, and there was no soft cushion or comfortable divan in sight, the practical, often hard objects of their craft would become their impromptu resting places. Imagine an artist mid-project feeling that undeniable pull towards sleep. There's no plush mattress or even a simple cot. Their gaze would sweep over the studio, quickly assessing what could offer even a momentary, albeit uncomfortable, support for their heavy head. You might picture a great master, perhaps worn out after hours of meticulous brushwork, slumping forward onto a large, sturdy wooden crate, typically used for transporting panels or storing raw pigments. The rough, splintery wood might not be comfortable, but it offered a solid surface and a temporary escape from the upright world. Or perhaps a pile of discarded rags, stiff with dried paint, and perhaps a bit dusty but still softer than the cold, hard stone floor. Historians still argue whether this pervasive physical discomfort somehow toughened their artistic resolve, or simply led to chronic aches and pains that went unrecorded. You, however, would likely just be grateful for any surface that didn't immediately try to poke your eye out. Sometimes the very implements of their trade became these unlikely aids. A heavy rolled-up canvas, perhaps one waiting to be stretched, or a study that hadn't yet found its purpose, could be repurposed as a makeshift bolster. It might be lumpy and probably smelled faintly of linseed oil and turpentine, but in the depths of overwhelming fatigue, it could feel surprisingly soft. You might even find an artist using a large, well-worn leather apron, folded just so as a temporary cushion for their head, the familiar scent of their craft accompanying them into a brief, if restless, slumber. The quiet irony of using the very instruments of their tireless labor as tools for momentary rest is quite poignant, isn't it? It's a testament to the fact that their work and their lives were so intertwined, even their exhaustion became part of the studio's utilitarian landscape. These weren't luxurious siestas. They were often awkward, contorted affairs where the artist would wake with a stiff neck, a faint imprint of a wooden edge on their cheek, or perhaps a streak of pigment across their face. But in those moments of overwhelming fatigue, any surface that offered a brief escape from conscious thought was a blessing. It speaks volumes about the intensity of their work and the pervasive lack of amenities that artists would resort to such improvised measures. The studio wasn't just a place of creation, it was a microcosm of their entire existence, where every object, even the most mundane, could serve a dual purpose, transforming from tool to temporary pillow in the blink of a sleep-deprived eye. So the next time you gaze upon a magnificent Renaissance work in a museum, take a moment to consider the less glamorous realities of its creation, perhaps even imagining the artist dozing off on a pile of dusty old sketches, dreaming of a truly soft bed. As we've journeyed through the Renaissance studio, observing the masters and their apprentices grappling with light patrons' fumes and creative blocks, it becomes abundantly clear that the phenomenon of the artistic nap isn't some historical anomaly. In fact, it speaks to the legacy of the nap, a practice that continues to resonate with creatives today, bridging centuries with the universal human need for rest. You see, while the tools and technologies have evolved, the fundamental mechanics of the human brain and body haven't changed all that much. The challenges of sustained creative output, the unpredictable ebb and flow of inspiration, and the sheer physical toll of intensive work are as relevant now as they were 500 years ago. Imagine a modern architect poring over blueprints late into the night wrestling with a structural problem, or a contemporary writer staring at a blank screen battling a particularly stubborn plot hole. Just like their Renaissance counterparts, they face deadlines, experience moments of profound frustration, and push themselves to the brink of exhaustion. And what is often the intuitive, almost instinctive response when the mind is fatigued and ideas refuse to flow? A nap. Perhaps it's a quick 15-minute power nap on a studio couch, or even just slumping over a desk for a few moments of quiet oblivion. Historians still argue whether the formal recognition of power naps in modern corporate culture truly enhances productivity or merely legitimizes what individuals have instinctively done for centuries. You, however, would likely just feel the familiar, insistent pull of sleep, regardless of whether you're surrounded by digital screens or turpentine-soaked rags. The very idea that a brief period of unconsciousness can lead to fresh insights, renewed problem-solving capabilities, and a significant boost in energy is a concept that has quietly persisted through the ages. Renaissance artists might not have had the scientific vocabulary of REM sleep cycles or cognitive restoration, but they intuitively understood that sometimes the most productive thing you could do was to temporarily disengage. The physical and mental demands of their craft, combined with the often rudimentary conditions of their studios, simply amplified this inherent human requirement for restorative rest. Remember that specific kind of mental fog that descends after hours of intense focus, where every thought feels sluggish and every solution seems elusive. A nap, even a short one, often acts as the perfect cognitive reset, cutting through the haze and allowing for clarity to return. So when you admire the luminous colors and intricate details of a masterpiece from the Florentine or Venetian schools, consider the less glamorous yet profoundly human reality of its creation. Those works were not only born from divine inspiration and years of rigorous training, but also, quite possibly, from the quiet, unrecorded moments of studio slumber. The silence of a dozing master, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping apprentice, the subtle thud of a head finding temporary solace on a wooden block. These were the unspoken, unseen rhythms of their creative lives. This shared human experience of battling fatigue and the natural inclination to counter it with a brief surrender to sleep forms, an unexpected yet powerful bridge across the centuries, linking the dusty, drafty workshops of the past to the bustling, bright, creative spaces of today. The artistic nap, in its various, often unglamorous forms, stands as a silent testament to the enduring rhythm of human creativity and the timeless need for a little bit of shut-eye, no matter how grand or ambitious your artistic vision might be. As our journey through the shadowy yet remarkably human world of Renaissance studio naps draws to a close, we arrive at a final, comforting truth: the universal human need for rest. It's a simple, undeniable fact that connects us intimately to those legendary figures of art history. You see, for all their genius, their profound spiritual insights, and their mastery of craft, Renaissance artists were ultimately flesh and blood, subject to the same biological rhythms and limits as you and I. Imagine one last time the quiet stillness descending upon a dusty studio. The master, perhaps tired from a relentless push on a challenging fresco, finally lets his brush hand fall, his head nodding forward onto his chest. An apprentice, weary from grinding pigments since before dawn, curls up in a tight ball beneath a workbench, oblivious to the faint smell of linseed oil and the distant clamor of the city. These weren't grand dramatic moments captured in historical texts. They were the quiet, almost invisible acts of survival etched into the daily fabric of their lives. Historians still argue about the true extent of chronic sleep deprivation in this era, but you can be sure it was a constant battle for many. The relentless demands of their profession, the grueling hours dictated by natural light, the unyielding deadlines set by powerful patrons, the physical toll of preparing materials, and the sheer mental exhaustion of sustained creative output all conspired to make these impromptu moments of repose not just desirable, but utterly essential. They weren't luxuries. They were necessities, brief interludes of unconsciousness that allowed their minds and bodies to reset, to process, and crucially to return to the easel with renewed if fleeting vigor. Remember that feeling of profound relief when you finally sit down after a long, tiring day and your body just wants to melt into the chair. That's what these artists experienced, perhaps amplified by the lack of modern comforts. The very spaces where they created enduring beauty were also places where they battled human frailty. The cold, damp air, the pungent fumes of their pigments, the constant threat of disease, and the sheer discomfort of their improvised resting spots all contributed to a pervasive fatigue that made the allure of a quick nap irresistible. Each stroke of paint, each chisel mark, each perfectly rendered form in the masterpieces we admire today could very well have been conceived or executed by an artist who had just emerged from a brief, deep slumber, perhaps with a new solution to a vexing artistic problem having unfolded in their dreams. This profound connection across time, this shared human experience of needing to simply close your eyes and rest, serves as a poignant reminder that even the most monumental achievements are rooted in the very basic, universal rhythms of life. The Renaissance artists, in their quiet pursuit of sleep, weren't just taking a break. They were embodying a timeless truth. Sometimes the greatest inspiration and the deepest restoration comes from simply letting go, if only for a few sweet moments. They were human after all, and even geniuses, especially those creating works for eternity, desperately needed their beauty sleep. Now, as the echoes of the Renaissance studio fade and the last whispers of our story settle, feel the gentle quiet deepen around you. Let the distant sounds of the day soften like a fading memory. Your own day, with all its demands and excitements, is gently receding now. There's nothing left to do, nowhere left to be, but right here, right now, as you let go. Allow your mind to drift like a boat on a calm, moonlit lake. Feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your covers as you surrender to the quiet comfort of the night. The artists of the past found their peace, however briefly, in their studios. Now it's your turn to find yours in the quiet sanctuary of your own space. Sleep will carry you gently like a soft breeze into the land of dreams. Sweet dreams.